Mara Ellison's boots echoed softly against the cracked pavement as she approached the waxen gallery. The late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the worn cobblestones of the town's main street. The building loomed ahead, a grand yet somber structure, its stone facade worn by time but still imposing. The sign above the heavy oak door read simply, "Waxen Gallery." The letters faded and chipped, as if reluctant to reveal the secrets held within. She paused, pulling her jacket tighter against the chill that had settled in the air, a cold that seemed to seep into her bones. Mara's sharp eyes scanned the entrance and the small crowd clustered nearby locals, whose faces were etched with worry and whispered fears. She heard fragments of conversation carried on the wind, words like vanished, unnatural, and don't go in. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the promise of a story aching to be uncovered. Crossing the threshold, Mara was immediately struck by the oppressive stillness inside the gallery. The air was thick and cold, the faint scent of wax mingling with dust, and something more elusive, something that prickled at the back of her mind. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows that danced across the walls adorned with rows of wax figures. Each one was posed with exquisite detail, Victorian ladies in flowing gowns, soldiers frozen mid-march, children caught in innocent play. Yet there was a quality to them that unsettled her deeply. Their eyes, glassy and unblinking, seemed almost too real, as if they held secrets beneath their cold surfaces. Mara raised her camera, the shutters click, breaking the silence as she captured the figures from every angle. Her fingers trembled slightly, a mix of excitement and unease swirling within her. She moved cautiously, notebook in hand, jotting down impressions and observations. The figure's stillness was suffocating, an unnatural quiet that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. As she ventured deeper into the gallery, whispers from the townsfolk outside echoed faintly in her mind. Stories of visitors who had come to marvel at the waxworks but never returned. Names lost to time, faces that now seemed eerily familiar among the statues. Mara's heart tightened at the thought, a cold knot of dread settling in her stomach. She stopped before a particularly striking figure, a woman in a delicate lace dress, her porcelain face flawless but unnervingly lifelike. Mara studied the figure's eyes, noting the subtle veins and the faint sheen that mimicked real tears. For a moment, she could have sworn the figure's gaze shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of movement that vanished as abruptly as it appeared. She blinked, questioning her own senses. A sudden creak echoed through the silence, making Mara start. She spun around, but the gallery was empty save for the statues. The sound seemed to come from the far end of the hall, where shadows pooled thick and impenetrable. She swallowed hard, the air feeling heavier, pressing down on her chest. Determined not to succumb to fear, Mara pressed on, her footsteps steady despite the growing tension. She paused at a display case filled with letters and photographs, artifacts that hinted at the gallery's long and troubled history. The curator's name, Elias Voss, appeared repeatedly, linked to whispered tales of dark rituals and unholy pacts. Mara's mind raced with questions. Was it possible that these wax figures were more than mere art? That the vanished visitors were somehow entwined with the gallery's secrets? She snapped more photos, her hands shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and foreboding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the gallery into shadows, Mara felt the weight of the stillness pressing in around her. The figures seemed to watch her now, their lifeless eyes following her every move. A suffocating silence wrapped around her, thick and unyielding, as if the very walls were holding their breath. She took a deep breath, fighting the creeping panic. This was just the beginning. Beneath the wax, Mara could feel the pulse of something dark and terrible, waiting to be uncovered. Her first night at the Waxen Gallery had only deepened the mystery on the dread. Yet, as she turned to leave, a faint whisper brushed against her ear, indistinct but chilling in its intimacy. Mara froze, heart hammering, before she finally stepped back into the cool night air. The gallery's shadow following her like a silent sentinel. The story was there, hidden beneath layers of wax and silence, and Mara was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. But as the door creaked shut behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had already stepped into a trap, one from which escape might prove impossible. The town's heart was a restless, whispering place that morning. The air thick with attention Mara could feel pressing at her chest as she stepped out of the modest inn and into the cobbled streets. The Waxen Gallery was a looming presence in the distance, its silhouette sharp against the pale sky, but the locals' eyes rarely turned toward it. Instead, they cast furtive glances, their voices low and hesitant whenever the museum's name slipped into conversation. Mara's first stop was the town's small cafe, a place where the scent of bitter coffee mixed with the faint aroma of baked bread and the undertone of whispered fears. She settled into a corner booth, her notebook open and pen poised, scanning the room for a potential source of information. An elderly woman caught her argus slight figure with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a worn handbag. Taking a breath, Mara approached gently. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm writing a story about the Waxen Gallery. I was wondering if you might share anything you know." The woman hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window where the gallery's ominous shape stood distant and silent. "It's not a place for the living to linger," she whispered. "My nephew, he went there last month, hasn't been seen since. The whole town talks about it, but no one dares say it loud." Mara's pen scratched hurriedly across the paper as the woman recounted hushed rumors of vanished visitors, the air around them thickening with a palpable unease. Other patrons listened discreetly, their faces etched with worry and suspicion. Whispers tangled with the clinking of cups and the occasional sigh, weaving a tapestry of fear that Mara felt tighten around her. Later, she met Simon Hale at the local library, a sanctuary of quiet and dusty tomes. Simon, with his pragmatic demeanor and sharp intellect, was already poring over old newspaper clippings and town records. "Look at this," he said, pushing a yellowed article across the table. "The Waxen Gallery opened over 50 years ago, but there are mentions of strange ceremonies dating back even further, tied to the town's founding families." Mara leaned in, her eyes scanning the faded print that hinted at occult rituals and secret societies. The weight of history settled over her. The gallery was more than just a museum. It was a crypt of dark memories and whispered pacts. As the day wore on, Mara wandered through the town square, noting how groups of residents clustered in hushed conversations. Their faces were masks of anxiety, their voices dropping to conspiratorial tones when she approached. The gallery's shadow cast a long, cold darkness over the community, an unspoken menace that seemed to seep into their very souls. That night, back in her modest lodgings, the flickering candlelight threw long, dancing shadows on the walls. Simon spread out a rough timeline of the museum's history and its eerie connection to occult practices. If these rituals were meant to bind someone to the wax, it could explain the disappearances, he murmured. Mara's mind raced, the tendrils of paranoia coiling tighter as the silence of the night seemed to suffocate her thoughts. The Waxen Gallery was no ordinary museum. Beneath its cold, still surface lay a darkness waiting to be uncovered, and Mara was determined to peel back the layers, no matter the cost. She closed her notebook with a decisive snap, the sound loud in the quiet room. Tomorrow, she would begin her deeper investigation. The whispers were growing louder, and Mara could no longer ignore the chilling truth lurking just beyond the veneer of wax and shadows. The waxen gallery felt colder than before, as if the very air had thickened overnight, pressing down on Mara like a tangible weight. She paused beneath the flickering sconces that lined the high vaulted walls, her breath shallow and uneven. Her camera hung heavy in her hands, its lens trained on the newest display. A meticulously crafted wax figure of a man standing rigidly beside a vintage phonograph. At first glance, there was nothing unusual until Mara's eyes caught a subtle flicker in the figure's gaze. A slight shift in the curve of its mouth. She blinked rapidly, stepping closer, heart pounding. The figure's stony expression seemed to soften, as if a ghost of a smile haunted its lips. She raised her camera and snapped a photo, the flash momentarily illuminating the figure's pallid skin and glassy eyes. "It's just a trick of the light," Mara muttered to herself, but the knot in her stomach tightened. She reviewed the image on the small screen, zooming in carefully. The figure's eyes seemed clearer, more alive than before. She frowned, a chill creeping along her spine. Simon's voice echoed softly from the gallery entrance. "Mara, you all right?" She turned to see him approaching, his brow furrowed with concern. "Something's off," she whispered. Simon stepped beside her, glancing at the figure. Wax figures can look unnervingly lifelike, but they don't move. That's what makes this place creepy, not supernatural. "I thought so too, until now," Mara said, voice trembling. "Look at this." She showed him the photo. Simon's eyes narrowed, studying the image. "Is that supposed to be someone?" "Yes, I recognized him from the missing persons reports." They moved on cautiously, passing row after row of statues, each more detailed than the last. Mara's camera clicked repeatedly, documenting the gallery's silent occupants. Each photo told a more disturbing story, subtle changes in facial features, a shift in posture, a glimmer of recognition that shouldn't have been possible. The museum's stillness felt suffocating now, like a thick fog pressing against her lungs. Footsteps echoed faintly, though no one else seemed to be near. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and whispers of forgotten voices teased her ears. Mara's fingers trembled as she adjusted the camera settings, desperate to capture evidence. "It's like they're watching us," she whispered, eyes darting between figures that seemed frozen in time but somehow alive. Simon placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Let's keep focused. We need proof, not panic." But Mara's skepticism was eroding fast. The uncanny valley, the unsettling space between lifeless wax and living flesh, was no longer theoretical. It was a trap, tightening around her sanity. Hours slipped by, unnoticed, as Mara catalogued the shifting gallery. The wax figures' faces bore the marks of the missing townsfolk, their eyes hollow yet hauntingly familiar. A cold sweat broke across her brow as she realized the truth she couldn't yet fully accept. The museum was changing them, absorbing the vanished. In a moment of restless pacing, Mara found herself drawn to a statue near the grand staircase, a woman with eyes eerily like her own. The figure's fingers twitched, and Mara recoiled, breath hitching. She stumbled back, heart hammering, the oppressive silence broken only by her ragged breathing. Simon's voice was urgent now. "We need to get out of here. This place isn't safe." Mara resisted the urge. "No, I need to understand this. If these statues are connected to the disappearances, then this is where the truth lies." The oppressive atmosphere pressed heavier still, the air thick with the scent of melted wax and something else, something faintly metallic and bitter. Mara's mind raced. The gallery was no longer just a museum. It was a prison, a coffin of cold stone and waxen flesh. As she raised her camera once more, a sudden chill swept through the hall. The statues seemed to lean just a fraction closer, their glassy eyes glinting with malevolent intent. Mara's breath caught, the line between observer and participant blurring dangerously. Her rational mind screamed to flee, but her journalist's resolve anchored her in place. She whispered a vow to herself to uncover the dark heart beneath the wax, no matter the cost. Outside, the murmurs of the town's frightened whispers pressed in missing persons, lost souls, vanished without a trace. Inside, the wax figures waited, still and silent, their eerie realism deepening the nightmare. Mara's journey into the suffocating stillness had only just begun. The gallery's shadows lengthened as the evening deepened. And Mara knew one thing for certain: she was no longer alone among the waxen dead. And somewhere beneath their cold surfaces, something was watching her back. The morning haze had barely lifted when Mara and Simon arrived at the town's library, a quaint, aging building that smelled of must and forgotten memories. The windows, streaked with grime, filtered the weak sunlight into soft beams that danced over rows of ancient tomes and brittle newspapers. They settled at a heavy wooden table, cluttered with piles of documents and faded photographs relating to the waxen gallery's origins. Simon adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to a brittle ledger. The pages yellowed and fragile beneath his careful fingers. "Look here," he murmured, tracing a line of faded script. "The museum was founded over 70 years ago, but there are mentions of unusual gatherings, meetings that don't appear in official records." Mara frowned, her sharp eyes scanning the text. "Occult practices," she whispered, a chill creeping through her veins. The silence around them seemed to thicken, as if the walls themselves listened. Hours slipped by as they unearthed references to secret societies and rituals tied to the museum's earliest days. The founder, a man named Elias Vosnow, the curator, had been a sculptor of some renown. Yet whispers of his obsession with capturing life in wax seeped through the records. Mara's pulse quickened with a mix of fear and determination. Later that afternoon, Mara sat in a dimly lit cafe, its cracked windows fogged with the scent of stale coffee and damp wood. A woman approached cautiously, her eyes darting nervously before settling on Mara. It was Lydia Crow, a former employee of the museum, her thin frame trembling under the weight of unspoken fears. Sliding into the seat opposite Mara, Lydia lowered her voice to a whisper. "There are passages beneath the gallery," she said, producing a folded note. "Hidden doors, secret rooms, places the curator doesn't want anyone to find." Mara unfolded the note carefully. It contained cryptic sketches and directions, hinting at a labyrinth beneath the museum's polished floors. "Why are you telling me this?" Mara asked. Lydia's hands shook visibly. "Because I'm afraid. I've seen things. The curator's obsession isn't just about art. It's about control, about trapping souls in stillness. If you want to survive, you have to understand what's really going on down there." That evening, back at the museum, Mara, Simon, and Lydia ventured cautiously into the shadowed underbelly of the building. Simon's flashlight cut through the thick darkness, illuminating walls carved with strange symbols and eerie motifs that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. As they moved deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, a suffocating pressure that pressed on their chests and muddled their thoughts. Lydia's whispered descriptions painted the curator as a man consumed by grief and madness, desperate to halt the inevitable decay of life through his dark rituals. Mara's heart pounded as she realized the full extent of the horror beneath the wax. The museum was no mere collection of figures, it was a prison, a tomb where the souls of the vanished were trapped in eternal stillness, and the curator's grip tightened with every secret they uncovered. Despite the growing dread, Mara's resolve hardened. She would follow these echoes of the past wherever they led, even if it meant confronting the darkness itself. The museum's secrets were unraveling, but the true nightmare was only just beginning. As they retreated from the hidden corridors, Mara glanced back at the silent wax figures that loomed like sentinels in the dim light, their glassy eyes reflecting a frozen eternity. The whispers of the past had spoken, and now the present demanded reckoning. Her investigation had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back from the shadows beneath the wax. The cold metal of the concealed panel pressed against Mara's palm was slick with a thin film of dust and something colder, almost clammy, that made her skin crawl. Lydia's trembling fingers guided her as they worked in near silence, the faintest scrape echoing unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness of the waxen gallery's upper hall. Mara's breath caught in her throat, a tight knot of anticipation and dread twisting deep inside her chest. This was it, the secret Lydia had hinted at, the passage that promised answers but threatened horrors. A soft click whispered through the silence as the panel swung open, revealing a narrow, shadowed corridor that slithered into darkness like a wound in the museum's heart. The air that exhaled from the gap was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of mold and something metallic, like dried blood. Mara flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the murk and revealing walls that seemed to pulse faintly with an unnatural sheen. The narrow passageway smelled of forgotten things, of silence long kept and secrets buried beneath layers of cold wax and dust. Lydia's eyes darted nervously toward the shadows, her hands trembling as she gripped Mara's arm. "This way," she whispered, voice cracking with fear and urgency. "The curator doesn't want anyone down here." Mara swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like the suffocating stillness that had haunted every corner of the gallery since her arrival. Steeling herself, she stepped forward, the floorboards creaking faintly beneath her boots. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with every step, as though the passage itself was alive, breathing a slow, malevolent breath. As they moved deeper, the faint outlines of forgotten wax figures emerged from the shadow statues, so lifelike they seemed to flicker on the edge of animation. Mara's flashlight caught the glint of glassy eyes, some smeared with dust, others unnervingly clear, reflecting her light back with an eerie moisture. Her heart pounded fiercely as she noticed subtle changes, a finger that twitched, a head that tilted imperceptibly, a mouth that seemed to part as if to breathe. "Do you see that?" Lydia whispered, voice barely audible. "They're not just statues anymore, they move." A cold shiver ran down Mara's spine. The uncanny valley had deepened, twisting into something darker, something alive. The wax figure's stillness was dissolving, replaced by a slow, deliberate animation that defied reason and filled the cramped corridor with unspoken menace. The silence was broken only by the faintest whisper, a breathy sound that seemed to slither from the walls themselves. Mara strained her ears, but could not place its source. Was it the wind, a trick of the air, or something else entirely? Her skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes watching, waiting. Suddenly, a figure ahead shifted. Mara froze, breath caught in her throat. The hand of a wax mana figure once posed in eternal repose, slowly, fingers bending with an agonized deliberation. The movement was so slight, so deliberate, it felt like a nightmare made flesh. Panic surged through Mara's veins, her pulse thundering loudly in her ears. She stumbled back, nearly knocking into Lydia, who grasped her arm tightly. "We have to keep moving," Lydia hissed, eyes wide with terror. "He's watching, the curator." Mara nodded, swallowing down the rising tide of fear. The hidden corridors stretched out before them like a living tomb, suffused with the horror of endless stillness and the creeping dread of becoming trapped in a waxen prison. Every step echoed like a death knell. Every shadow seemed to twist into something sinister. The passage led them deeper into the bowels of the waxen gallery, revealing rooms filled with half-formed figures. Sculpted faces frozen in expressions of torment or ecstasy, their eyes glassy pools that seemed to shimmer in the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of melted wax and ancient secrets, suffocating in its heaviness. Mara's mind raced with questions and grim possibilities. What dark rituals had created this living gallery of horrors? How many souls had been stolen, frozen beneath layers of wax and silence? And most terrifying of all was she next. As they pressed onward, the atmosphere thickened, the oppressive stillness wrapping around them like a shroud. Mara's breath came in shallow gasps, her senses stretched taut as every sound, every flicker of movement, seemed magnified in the claustrophobic depths. Then, from the corner of her eye, Mara caught another twitcher wax figure's head slowly turned, eyes locking with hers in a glare so cold and lifeless it sent a jolt of pure terror crashing through her. She stumbled backward, heart hammering, voice catching in her throat. "We're not alone," she whispered, barely daring to breathe. The corridors seemed to pulse with unseen life as the wax figures shifted, inching closer with deliberate, terrifying animation. The boundary between the living and the inanimate blurred until it was impossible to tell. Where one ended and the other began, Mara knew then that the gallery was no mere museum of wax. It was a tomb, a prison, a cage for souls trapped beneath a suffocating veil of stillness and silence. And she was trapped within its grasp, the darkness pressing in from all sides. With Lydia's urgent whisper urging her forward, Mara steeled herself. There was no turning back now. The secret beneath the wax had been revealed, and with it, the nightmare had only just begun. The walls seemed to close tighter, the air growing heavier with dread as Mara pressed onward. Every step a descent deeper into the suffocating heart of the waxen gallery's dark secret. The figures watched, waited, and the silence screamed. And somewhere in the shadows, Elias Voss, the curator, smiled his pale, cruel smile, knowing his grip only tightened. The air inside the waxen gallery was cold and still, thick with a silence that pressed against Mara's eardrums like a physical weight. Her footsteps echoed faintly on the polished floor, swallowed quickly by the cavernous space. She paused beneath the dim glow of a flickering overhead bulb, the light casting long, distorted shadows across rows of wax figures, arrayed like silent sentinels. Mara raised her camera, the lens focusing on a statue of a woman in Victorian dress, her eyes glassy, lips parted slightly as though on the verge of speech. The realism was unsettling the delicate veins in the pale wax skin, the subtle blush on her cheeks, the tiny flecks of dust caught in the folds of her gown. Mara's breath hitched, a chill crawling up her spine. She clicked the shutter, then lowered the camera to study the figure more closely. Something was off. The woman's hand twitched a minute, almost imperceptible movement. Mara blinked, wondering if it was a trick of the light or her imagination playing cruel games. But no, the fingers curled slightly, as if reaching for something unseen. Her heart hammered wildly. She took a cautious step back, eyes locked on the figure's face, which now seemed to hold a flicker of life in its glassy stare. "Simon," she whispered, voice trembling. "Did you see that?" Simon Hale, standing a few paces behind her, adjusted his glasses, his brows knitting in concern. "See what?" she pointed, but when he turned, the hand was still again. "Maybe you're just tired." Mara shook her head. She knew what she saw. The suffocating stillness of the museum had begun to crack, revealing something far more sinister beneath. Her pulse quickened, breaths shallow and sharp in the frigid air. Determined to prove she wasn't losing her mind, Mara edged closer to the figure. The gallery felt alive now, the walls closing in, the silence more oppressive. Her fingers brushed the cool wax of the statue's arm. Suddenly, a cold grip wrapped around her wrist. Panic exploded in her chest as every muscle seized, her limbs stiffening as if petrified. The world tilted. She was frozen, caught in the statue's pose, her breath stolen by an invisible force. Mara, Simon's shout shattered the silence. His hands grasped her shoulders, shaking her with desperate urgency. Slowly, sensation returned, the paralysis loosening like a breaking spell. Mara gasped, stumbling back, eyes wide with terror. Around them, the wax figures seemed to lean closer, their frozen faces twisted with silent menace. "We have to get out of here," Mara choked out, voice barely audible. Simon nodded, leading her swiftly through the maze of statues, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Behind them, a faint creaking echoed, the sound of wax stretching and shifting in a way that defied reason. Mara's mind raced, the encounter shattering her disbelief and igniting a desperate urgency to uncover the truth. Outside the gallery's cold embrace, Mara pressed her forehead against the frosted glass of the exit door, struggling to steady her breath. The waxen gallery was no mere museum. It was a prison of frozen souls, and the wax figures were not statues, they were captors. Mara's investigation had just become a fight for survival. The shadows lengthened as the night deepened, and somewhere inside, the curator's sinister presence watched, waiting. Mara knew the horrors beneath the wax were only beginning to reveal themselves, and if she wasn't careful, she too would become a permanent exhibit in the suffocating stillness. But she wouldn't give up, not yet. Not while any flicker of life remained in her racing heart. With Simon by her side, she vowed to confront the darkness lurking beneath the wax, no matter the cost. As the door clicked shut behind them, a single wax hand twitched once more in the fading light, a silent promise of the nightmare still to come. The room was suffused with a dim, flickering light, cast by a lone candle perched precariously atop a rickety wooden crate. Shadows danced along the peeling wallpaper like restless spirits, their movements echoing the unease that gripped Mara as she sat opposite Lydia Crow. The former employee's thin frame was hunched forward, her hands trembling as they clutched a faded, sepia-toned photograph. The image depicted a gaunt man with piercing black eyes and a grim expression. Elias Voss, the curator. Lydia's voice was barely a whisper, fragile yet charged with a painful intensity. "He wasn't always like this," she began, pausing to steady her breath. "When I first joined the museum, Elias was different. A passionate artist, obsessed with capturing life in wax. Yes, but there was warmth in his eyes." Mara leaned in, her sharp eyes reflecting the candlelight, signaling her full attention. "What changed?" she asked softly. Lydia swallowed hard, fingers tightening round the photograph. The loss, his family, it shattered him. After that, it was like he was consumed by a darkness no one could reach. He became obsessed not just with preserving life, but with freezing it forever. Eternal stillness, eternal control. The air in the cramped room grew heavier, the silence stretching taut between them as Lydia's words sank in. Mara's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the curator's tragic descent. The wax figures, so disturbingly lifelike, were no longer mere art, they were prisons, vessels for stolen souls. He performed rituals, Lydia continued, her voice trembling. Dark rituals that bound the souls of those who vanished here to their waxen forms. It was his way of conquering death, of stopping time itself. But it wasn't salvation, only eternal suffocation. Mara's heart pounded, the oppressive stillness of the museum seeping into her bones. She could almost hear the faint whispers that seemed to rise from the very walls, the echoes of trapped souls pleading in silence. "How did you escape?" she asked. Lydia's eyes darted nervously toward the door. "I tried to resist, but the fear was suffocating. I barely made it out. Now, I want to help you stop him before he claims more victims." A sudden creak from the hallway jolted them both. Mara's breath hitched as she rose, instincts sharpened by months of investigation. The danger was no longer abstract. It was close, lurking just beyond the shadows. "Thank you, Lydia," Mara said, her voice steady despite the chill crawling up her spine. "Your story, it changes everything." As they prepared to delve deeper into the museum's darkest secrets, Mara felt a fire ignite within her, a fierce determination fueled by the weight of Lydia's confession. The curator was no longer just a shadowy figure in the background. He was a tragic monster whose twisted desire for control threatened to consume them all. With a final glance at the photograph, Mara whispered to herself, "I will end this. No one else will be lost beneath the wax." Outside, the waxen gallery loomed, silent and cold, its eerie stillness a facade masking the horrors that festered within. The battle for the trapped souls was just beginning, and Mara knew the path ahead would test every ounce of her courage and resolve. But even as she steeled herself, a nagging doubt lingered. How deep did Elias Voss's darkness truly run? And could she survive the suffocating nightmare that awaited in the heart of the waxen gallery? The candle flickered once more, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like fingers, promising that the stillness beneath the wax was far from over. Mara swallowed hard, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her like a shroud. Yet beneath that weight, a spark of hope glimmered. With Lydia's courage guiding her, she would face the darkness and fight to shatter the curse that held the vanished captive. The night was far from over, and the true horror was yet to come. The waxen gallery seemed to hold its breath as Mara, Ellison, and Simon Hale stepped beyond the grand entrance into the dimly lit corridors. The air was heavy, thick with an unspoken menace that clung to their skin, pressing down on their chests with invisible fingers. The wax figures lining the walls stood silent and still, yet their glassy eyes seemed to track every movement, reflecting flickering shadows that danced with a life of their own. Mara's camera hung from her neck, its lens capturing the unnerving tableau, but the photographs never quite seemed to capture the eerie atmosphere that gnawed at her nerves. Simon adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "The place feels like it's watching us," he muttered, voice low, "almost like the wax itself is alive." Mara nodded, the hairs on her arms prickling. "I can feel it too, like the walls are closing in." Their uneasy exploration was abruptly halted by the sudden appearance of Jonathan Reed. The security guard's broad frame blocked the narrow hallway, his expression stern and unreadable beneath the harsh overhead lighting. He wore the crisp uniform of the museum staff, but his eyes held a hardness that Mara hadn't noticed before. "You're not supposed to be here," Jonathan said, voice cold and authoritative. "This area is off limits." Mara squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. "I'm here to write a story. I have every right to be anywhere in the museum." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver, but an unsettling smile flickered at the edges of his mouth. "The curator doesn't like visitors poking around where they shouldn't. You'd do well to remember that." Simon stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "We're just trying to understand what's happening here about the disappearances." Jonathan's eyes darkened and his voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "Some truths are better left buried beneath the wax." Before they could respond, a faint murmur reached their ears, a voice, low and hypnotic, drifting from an unseen corner of the museum. Mara's heart hammered as she recognized the tone, the inflection. Elias Voss, the curator, was near. Driven by a mixture of fear and determination, Mara and Simon edged closer to a narrow service door slightly ajar. Through the crack, they could hear Elias's voice weaving a strange cadence, words that seemed to ripple like a dark spell. He spoke of preservation, eternal stillness, and the price of defying death. The museum's staff responded in hushed tones, their voices laced with unease but obedience. It was clear that Elias's influence was no mere professional authority, was a supernatural grip tightening around those who worked beneath his watchful eyes. Mara swallowed hard, the oppressive atmosphere wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. The wax figures nearby seemed to shimmer faintly, their eyes flickering with an otherworldly glow. She could almost feel the malevolent presence of the curator pressing down on her, a weight that threatened to crush her resolve. "We need to be careful," Simon whispered urgently. "He's more dangerous than we thought." Mara nodded, the fire of determination burning brighter despite the fear clawing at her insides. "We can't let him win, not after everything we've uncovered." But as Jonathan's footsteps echoed closer, the cruel reality settled in. The curator's grip was tightening. And every step Mara took deeper into the waxen gallery plunged her further into a suffocating nightmare where the line between life and wax blurred, and the price of discovery might be more than she could bear. The hallways seemed to close in, shadows deepening as the lurking presence of Elias Voss grew ever more palpable. Mara's breath came shallow, the silence around her broken only by the faint, unsettling creaks that whispered through the museum's ancient bones. The fight was far from over, and the curator's grip was tightening with every passing moment, threatening to extinguish the light of truth before it could ever see the dawn. As Mara turned to Simon, determination stealing her features, she knew one thing with chilling certainty. The sinister heart of the waxen gallery beat stronger than ever, and escaping its grasp would demand all her courage and wit. The shadows lengthened, and the waxen eyes watched, waiting for the moment to close in. The air in the lower corridors of the waxen gallery was thick and stale, pressing heavily against Mara Ellison's chest with each shallow breath. The faint hum of distant flickering lights barely penetrated the dense shadows that clung to the narrow hallways like a living entity. Her footsteps, once confident and purposeful, had transformed into cautious, nearly silent taps, as if any louder sound might awaken the dormant horrors around her. She paused, her eyes scanning the walls lined with endless wax figures, their glassy eyes reflecting the dim light, following her every movement with unsettling stillness. The corridor twisted and turned, a labyrinth of claustrophobic passages that seemed designed to disorient. Mara's wristwatch had long since stopped making sense. The hands spun erratically, mocking the passage of time in this suffocating tomb. She swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat a tangible reminder of the oppressive atmosphere tightening around her. The cold seeped through her jacket, but it was not the cold of the arid. It was the cold of something far more sinister, an invisible weight that chilled her soul. As she ventured deeper, the wax figures grew grotesquely lifelike. Their skin, so smooth and pale, caught the flickering light, revealing veins and fine lines that should not have been possible on mere wax. Their faces were frozen in expressions of rapture, agony, or silent screams, and their glassy eyes seemed to harbor secrets that pressed against Mara's mind like a relentless tide. A shudder passed through her. For the briefest moment, she could have sworn one of the figures blinked. The walls seemed to breathe, subtly pulsing in and out, as if the museum itself was alive and breathing alongside her. A distant whisper echoed down the passage, a soft, indistinct murmur that set Mara's nerves alight. She turned abruptly, heart hammering, but the corridor behind her was empty, save for the unyielding stillness of the waxen sentinels. Her breath caught as the shadows lengthened and flickered, distorting the familiar shapes into monstrous forms. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred. The floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple like the surface of a dark pond disturbed by an unseen force. Mara gripped the rough plaster of the wall, grounding herself, willing her mind not to fracture under the strain. Suddenly, a cold dread swept over her. Han image flashed in her mind's eye, her own body, frozen and sealed in a statue of cold. Unyielding wax, forever trapped in silent agony beneath the museum's suffocating surface. The thought was unbearable, suffocating in its finality, and Mara stumbled backward, gasping for air that felt thick and unyielding. "Simon," she whispered, clutching her phone to check the weak signal. No response. The silence mocked her, wrapping tighter than any chains. She was alone in this living tomb, a prisoner of shadows and stillness. As she pressed forward, guided only by the faint glow of her flashlight, the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, walls closing in as the air thickened. Every step felt heavier, as if the museum sought to swallow her whole, to bind her to its eternal stillness. The wax figures loomed closer, their faces melding with the dark, their silent gazes suffocating her resolve. Mara forced herself to breathe deeply, focusing on the rough texture of the wall beneath her fingertips, the sharp scent of old wax and dust filling her nostrils. She repeated a mantra in her mind. She was alive. She was not one of them. She would not become a statue. But the suffocating nightmare pressed on, relentless and consuming. As the boundaries of time and space dissolved into a chaotic blur, Mara's pulse raced, her vision swimming with shadows and light. And she knew the deepest horrors of the waxen gallery were yet to come. And somewhere, deep beneath the cold surface of the wax, a darkness waited patient, eternal and hungry. The nightmare was just beginning. The waxen gallery seemed to breathe a silence so profound that it pressed heavily against Mara's chest, constricting her breath with the weight of unseen eyes. Each step she took echoed unnaturally loud, bouncing off the high, vaulted ceilings as if the shadows themselves absorbed the sound, twisting it into something sinister. The wax figures, once mere objects of chilling artistry, now loomed like sentinels, alive with malevolent intent. Mara's eyes darted from one figure to another, noticing subtle shifts she hadn't seen before. Fingers curled slightly, eyes glistened with a moisture that wasn't wax, and lips parted as if to whisper secrets just beyond her hearing. Her heart pounded as she moved deeper into the gallery, the air growing colder, heavier, suffused with an oppressive stillness that was anything but peaceful. The shadows cast by the figures writhed and stretched, contorting into grotesque shapes that toyed with her sanity. A faint murmur curled around her ears, susurrus of voices, fragmented and unintelligible, yet laced with a despair that clawed at her soul. In the cramped back room of the museum, Simon sat hunched over a cluttered desk, strewn with brittle papers and aged tomes, His fingers trembled as he turned the fragile pages, his breath fogging the glass of his glasses. The yellowed documents were written in archaic script, detailing rituals that bound the essence of life itself into wax, preserving not beauty but eternal imprisonment. Simon's eyes widened as he pieced together the curator's twisted masterpiece, a dark enchantment designed to capture and control souls, freezing them in an unending tableau of stillness and silence. "Mara," Simon whispered urgently over the phone, his voice tight with fear. "This isn't just about art or obsession. Elias Voss is enslaving people's souls, transforming the missing into these statues. The wax isn't just wax, it's a prison." Mara's grip on reality faltered as she clutched the phone. Her surroundings blurred. The wax figures seemed to flicker in and out of focus, their faces morphing into distorted masks of agony and rage. One statue's eyes caught hers, gleaming with a cruel intelligence as a slow, sinister smile crept across its lips before freezing again into stone-cold stillness. The gallery's oppressive atmosphere thickened, suffocating her with an unbearable weight. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and a cold sweat slicked her skin. She staggered back, nearly collapsing against the wall, battling the surge of paranoia that whispered the horrifying possibility that soon she too might be trapped beneath the wax, a silent witness to her own demise. Determined not to succumb, Mara forced herself to focus. Every detail mattered, the faintest flicker of movement, the softest whisper, the chilling cold that lingered in the air. She met Simon in a shadowed corner of the museum's depths, where the air was thick with dust and secrets. Their whispered exchange was frantic, yet measured as they laid bare the extent of the curator's dark ritual. "We have to find a way to break this," Mara said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "If these souls are trapped, then so are we unless we act." Simon nodded grimly, eyes scanning the room for threats unseen. Around them, the wax figures loomed like silent predators, their unnerving stillness a fragile veil for the horror lurking just beneath. Together, they faced the fractured reality of the waxen gallery, a nightmare, where the line between life and artifice had been grotesquely erased. With every heartbeat echoing in the suffocating silence, Mara and Simon prepared to delve deeper into the darkness, aware that the curator's malevolent influence was tightening its grip. As Mara glanced once more at the twisted shadows flitting across the cold marble, she steeled herself. The horror was no longer a distant mystery, it was a living nightmare, and she was trapped within its suffocating embrace. The question that burned through her mind was no longer if she could survive, but how she could escape the eternal stillness beneath the wax. And somewhere in the depths, those souls waited silent, frozen and desperate. The gallery held its breath, so did Mara, and the shadows waited to claim her next. The chamber was cloaked in shadows, the only light coming from a solitary candle flickering atop a dusty pedestal. Mara's breath hitched as the tall, gaunt figure stepped from the darkness. Silas Voss, the curator. His pale face was drawn tight, like parchment stretched over bone, and his eyes gleamed with an unnatural polish, black as obsidian and equally impenetrable. "You've come far, Mara," he said softly, voice echoing with a strange mixture of weariness and fervor. "But you know nothing of what lies beneath the wax." Mara gripped her camera tightly, the cold metal a small comfort against the oppressive stillness. "I want to understand," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Elias smiled, a thin, bitter curve of lips. "Understanding is the first step to entrapment. But since you insist, I will tell you the truth that no one else dares speak." He gestured to a cracked portrait hanging askew on the wall behind him. The faded image showed a family hymn, a woman and a young girl smiling in a sunlit garden. The sight was jarringly domestic amid the macabre surroundings. "Once I was a sculptor," Elias began, voice low and heavy. "A man who loved life and sought to capture its beauty in wax. But life is cruel. It took everything from me. My wife, my daughter, gone in a night of fire and ruin." Mara's heart clenched, sympathy mingling with growing dread. "I'm sorry." "No apologies," Elias said, turning to face her fully. "Their absence haunted me, drove me to madness. I could not bear the ephemeral nature of flesh and blood, so I sought a way to capture life eternally, to freeze it in time, safe from death's grasp." He moved slowly toward a display, lifting a half-formed wax figure from a nearby table. The figure was pale and translucent, veins faintly visible beneath the surface, its eyes half closed in a peaceful expression. "This is the ritual," Elias said, voice almost reverent. "A binding of souls to wax, preserving them beyond mortal decay. They do not suffer, they do not age. They are eternal, still, and safe." Mara's eyes widened as the figure's eyelids twitched imperceptibly. A shiver ran down her spine. "It's alive," she whispered. "Not alive," Elias corrected gently. "Frozen, perfect." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, pressing against Mara's lungs like a physical weight. She could feel the coldness creeping from the waxen figure to her very skin, a chilling reminder of her own fragile mortality. "And what of me?" Mara asked, voice barely audible. "What happens if I refuse to leave?" Elias's smile darkened. "You will join them," he said simply, "a part of my gallery forever. Your soul encased in wax, preserved in eternal stillness." Panic surged through Mara, but beneath it, a fierce determination took root. She would not become another lost visitor, another silent statue in this house of horrors. There was still a chance to break free, to shatter the curse. "I won't let you do this," she said firmly, stepping back toward the chamber's exit. "Ah," Elias murmured, eyes glinting with a sinister light. "But you have already stepped too far beneath the wax." The candle flickered violently as shadows twisted and lengthened, the room seeming to pulse with a life of its own. Mara's heart thundered in her chest as the air thickened, the suffocating silence pressing down like a vice. She knew the true horror now. The curator's obsession was not mere madness, but a perverse salvation, a trap from which escape was perilously uncertain. And yet, within that knowledge burned a flicker of hope. If she could understand the ritual, perhaps she could unravel it. With measured breaths, Mara turned away from Elias Voss and the waxen figure that trembled faintly in his hands. The darkness of the chamber was absolute, but the fire in her eyes was not yet extinguished. The air in the waxen gallery had thickened, an almost palpable weight pressing down on Mara's chest, each breath a struggle against the invisible force clawing at her lungs. She stumbled forward, clutching her camera like a lifeline, the dim light casting long, sinister shadows across the cold marble floor. Around her, the wax figures seemed to lean closer, their glassy eyes gleaming with a life that was not their own. The eerie silence was shattered only by the faintest creak of the old wooden beams overhead and the soft, almost imperceptible shifting of the statue's forms. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned a corner and found herself in a narrow chamber she had never seen before. The walls were lined with mirrors, but the reflections were distorted, her image flickering like a candle flame caught in a draught. The wax figures that crowded the room were closer now, their faces morphing subtly, mocking the missing townsfolk she had been investigating. Panic surged through her veins as she realized the true horror. The curator's ritual was not just a myth. It was happening here, now. Suddenly, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Elias Voss, the curator, stepped forward with a chilling grace, his gaunt face illuminated by flickering candlelight. His obsidian eyes bore into Mara's soul, cold and implacable. "You have come far, Mara," he intoned, voice smooth as silk but edged with menace. "But the ritual is eternal. The souls preserved here belong to me now." Mara's breath hitched as he began to chant in a language that twisted her mind. A sound like the grinding of ancient stones echoing in the suffocating silence. The room seemed to contract, the walls closing in, the wax figure's hands reaching out to grasp her with cold, unyielding fingers. She tried to move, but her limbs were betraying her, stiffening as if the very air were congealing into chains. Just as the paralysis threatened to claim her, a sharp voice shattered the spell. "Mara!" Simon's shout cut through the enchantment like a blade. Bursting into the chamber, he lunged at the nearest wax figure, knocking it aside with desperate strength. The sudden violence broke the curator's hold, and Mara gasped, muscles loosening as she stumbled free from the creeping freeze. Together, they fled through the twisting corridors, the museum itself seeming to awaken in fury. The wax figures convulsed, faces twisting into grotesque expressions of rage and despair, their forms melting and reforming in a nightmarish dance. The walls groaned, and the floor trembled beneath their feet as the ritual's dark power began to unravel. Mara's mind raced, adrenaline sharpening her senses even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. The curator's voice echoed faintly behind them, a promise of return and vengeance. But for now, the ritual's hold had been broken, if only temporarily. As they burst into the cold night air outside, Mara collapsed against the crumbling stone steps, gasping for breath. The museum behind them shuddered and cracked, a dying beast releasing its last breath. Yet the suffocating stillness that had gripped her heart lingered, a chilling reminder that beneath the wax lay a darkness far older and more relentless than she had imagined. "We have to end this," Mara whispered, eyes fixed on the burning ruins, "before it's too late." Simon nodded, his face pale but resolute. "We will, together." But as the firelight flickered against Mara's haunted expression, the question remained, could they truly escape the curator's grasp? Or was the ritual's hold already too strong, binding them forever in the uncanny valley between life and death? The night deepened, and the shadows stretched long and hungry. Beneath the wax, the silence waited her, suffocating, eternal stillness that would not release its prisoners so easily. Mara closed her eyes, steeling herself for the battle to come. The nightmare was far from over. The air grew heavier with each step as Mara, Simon, and Lydia descended the narrow staircase concealed behind the false wax panel that Lydia had revealed. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows that danced unnervingly on the wax-lined walls, distorting the faces of the statues into something even more sinister. The oppressive silence of the waxen gallery was replaced here by the subtle creaks of their footsteps and the occasional distant drip of moisture echoing through the hidden corridors. "Are you sure this is the way?" Simon whispered, his voice taut with anxiety. His eyes, magnified slightly by his glasses, darted nervously along the dark passage. Lydia nodded, her thin frame tense but resolute. This chamber was where the original rituals were performed. If there's any hope of undoing what Elias has done, it lies here. Mara's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed forward, the weight of the suffocating stillness pressing down on her mind. Every wax figure they passed seemed to lean in closer, their glassy eyes following, their unnerving lifelikeness, a constant reminder of the trapped souls beneath the surface. She snapped photos sporadically, her fingers trembling despite her determination. At last, they reached a stout stone door, its surface etched with intricate symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Mara's fingers traced the cold carvings, a shiver running down her spine. These symbols, they look like some kind of protective wards, she murmured. Lydia produced a worn manuscript, its pages yellowed and brittle. This is from the museum's original archives. It describes a counter-ritual, a way to disrupt the binding spell that traps souls in wax. But it's dangerous. If we fail, we could become part of the collection ourselves. The room felt alive with a thick, choking silence as Mara spread the manuscript across the stone altar. Simon began to read the instructions aloud, his voice steady despite the rising tension. As Mara prepared the necessary components, her hands moving with practiced precision despite the terror coiling in her gut, the wax figures outside the chamber seemed to react. Faint creaks and shifting sounds echoed through the halls, like the museum itself resisting their intrusion. "We don't have much time," Lydia warned, glancing nervously toward the door. "Elias's power is strongest when we interfere." Mara took a deep breath and began the incantation, her voice breaking the silence, weaving ancient words into the air. The symbols on the floor started to glow brighter, as if awakening from a long slumber. Outside, the wax figures began to crack and distort grotesquely, their frozen faces twisting in silent, eternal screams. Sweat beaded on Mara's brow as the chamber trembled. The suffocating stillness shattered into chaotic noise, the creaking and cracking of wax, the rising howl of wind through the hidden corridors, and the distant, furious shouts of Elias Voss. "Hold steady," Simon urged, clutching Mara's arm as a fissure appeared in the statue of a once smiling child nearby. Pieces of wax flaked off, revealing faint glimpses of pale, trapped flesh beneath. The ritual's power surged through the chamber, the light from the symbols flaring with blinding intensity. Mara's voice rose, cracking with desperation and resolve, until the final words fell into silence. When the last echo faded, an eerie calm returned. The wax figures were cracked, shattered in places, their faces no longer serene but broken and vulnerable. The oppressive stillness that had pressed on Mara's chest was lifted, replaced by a fragile hope. "We did it," Lydia breathed, tears glistening in her eyes. "But this is only the beginning," Mara said grimly. "Elias won't let this go quietly." As they prepared to leave the chamber, the distant rumble of collapsing walls and the sinister murmur of the curator's voice echoed through the labyrinth, a chilling reminder that the greatest battle was yet to come. The silence beneath the wax had been broken, but the darkness was far from defeated. Mara's heart thrummed with a mixture of dread and determination. The next steps would decide not only the fate of the trapped souls, but her own fragile existence. And somewhere, deep within the crumbling museum, the curator watched, his eyes like polished obsidian gleaming with malevolent intent. The stillness was no longer absolute, but his grip remained strong and he would fight to keep it so. The suffocating nightmare was far from over. The air was thick with a suffocating silence as Mara stepped cautiously into the heart of the waxen gallery, the chamber that pulsed with an unnatural life all its own. The walls seemed to breathe, their surfaces rippling like wax melting under some invisible flame, and shadows twisted unnervingly in the flickering candlelight. At the center stood Elias Voss, the curator, his gaunt figure clad in dark Victorian garb, his obsidian eyes gleaming coldly as he awaited her arrival. The cold dread that had coiled tightly within Mara all these days now surged into a full tidal wave of terror and resolve. "Welcome, Mara," Elias intoned, his voice echoing hollowly in the warped space. "You've come far, but this is where your journey ends." Mara's heart hammered fiercely, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "It ends only when the truth is free," she replied. Clutching the relic Lydia had entrusted to her small, intricately carved talisman said to disrupt the ritual's power. Around them, the wax figures shifted subtly, their faces warping between their eternal stillness and grotesque animation. Some bore the faintest resemblance to those who had vanished, their eyes dark pools that seemed almost alive. The boundaries between animate and inanimate blurred, and the room's oppressive atmosphere thickened, pressing against Mara's lungs like a weighty fog. Elias began chanting, a guttural, ancient tongue that reverberated through the chamber, shaking the very foundation of Mara's sanity. The wax figures responded, their limbs twitching, surfaces cracking with tiny fractures that glinted like spiderwebs of broken glass. The air grew heavier, the scent of melting wax and cold stone mingling in a nauseating haze. Mara's vision blurred. Time fractured into shards as the chamber distorted walls stretching endlessly, floors folding beneath her feet. She stumbled, but forced herself to steady her breath, her fingers curling around the talisman. "Not like this," she whispered fiercely. Summoning every ounce of courage and clarity, Mara raised the talisman, its carved runes glowing faintly in the darkness. She pressed it to the cold stone floor, and a pulse of light radiated outward, cutting through the thick miasma like a blade. The wax statues groaned and cracked, their frozen forms shuddering as trapped souls cried out silently within their prisons. Elias snarled, his form flickering grotesquely between man and monstrous wax hybrid. His eyes blazed with malevolent fury as he lunged at Mara, the air crackling with the force of his unnatural power. Mara twisted away, adrenaline fueling her every move as time snapped and stretched around them. With a final, desperate surge, she shattered the dark sigil etched into the floor, the source of Elias's binding magic. A deafening silence followed, broken only by the sound of cracking wax and the spectral release of countless souls, their anguished whispers fading into freedom. The chamber trembled violently as the museum's reality began to collapse. Mara barely escaped the crumbling structure, her body and mind battered but alive. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, the suffocating stillness replaced by a haunting, fragile quiet. But as Mara looked back at the ruins, a shiver ran down her spine. Though the ritual was broken and the souls freed, the darkness beneath the wax was not so easily banished. Somewhere in the depths of her mind, the eerie stillness lingered, a silent echo of the horror she had survived, and the dread that it might one day return. The final confrontation had ended, but Mara's battle with the shadows beneath the wax was far from over. The chamber beneath the waxen gallery was a cavernous maw carved from cold stone, lined with thousands of wax figures frozen in grotesque poses of agony and ecstasy, each face a mask of silent torment. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, the air thick with the scent of melted wax and something far older, a suffocating heaviness pressing on her chest, as if the very atmosphere conspired to choke hope from her lungs. Simon's voice was a hushed murmur beside her. "This is it, Mara. This is where the souls are trapped." Lydia's trembling fingers brushed the wall, tracing the ancient symbols etched deep into the stone. The ritual, it holds them here, bound to the wax, to the stillness. If we don't break it now, none will ever be free. Ahead, the central altar rose, a grotesque effigy of a human figure, its waxen surface gleaming unnaturally under the flickering torchlight. The curator, Elias Voss, emerged from the shadows, his gaunt frame draped in flowing Victorian black eyes like polished obsidian reflecting an eerie light. "So, you've come to shatter eternity," he said, voice cold and unyielding. "But stillness is salvation. Life is chaos. Wax preserves perfection." Mara's grip tightened on the ritual dagger she had seized from Lydia's trembling hands. "Your salvation is a prison. You're stealing lives, stealing souls." The curator stepped forward, shadows seeming to reach out from his coat, curling around the frozen figures. "I offer them peace. Their suffering ended not by death, but by stillness. You cannot comprehend what you destroy." Without hesitation, Mara lunged, driving the dagger into the heart of the wax effigy. A shattering crack tore through the silence as the figure splintered, molten wax dripping like blood. A piercing scream, neither wholly human nor entirely spectral, ripped through the chamber, reverberating in Mara's bones. The walls trembled, dust raining from the vaulted ceiling. The wax figures groaned, cracking and crumbling, their eerie stillness giving way to a chaotic release of trapped agony. Mara grabbed Simon's arm, pulling him toward the exit. "We have to get out, now," she shouted, voice raw but resolute. The curator's scream twisted into a howl of rage and despair. "You will never escape. The stillness is eternal." But the gallery was collapsing, stone and plaster crumbling as the ritual's hold unraveled. Mara's heart hammered in her chest as they darted through twisting corridors, debris crashing around them. Lydia's breath was ragged, her eyes wild but determined. Outside, the dawn broke over the ruined museum, casting pale light over the smoky rubble. The suffocating silence was shattered by cries, voices once trapped, now freed, echoing into the new day. Mara sank to her knees amidst the chaos, tears streaking through the grime on her face. The horror had been broken, yet the weight of what she'd witnessed pressed down like the waxen stillness she had shattered. Simon knelt beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's over. The souls are free." But Mara knew the darkness beneath the wax was not so easily banished. It lingered in her mind, a suffocating echo of stillness and loss, a shadow stitched into the fabric of her soul. As the sun rose, she realized some horrors never truly end, they only wait, frozen just beneath the surface, ready to be awakened again. And the waxen gallery was gone, but the curse beneath the wax was a wound that would never fully heal. She rose, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. The story was far from over. The darkness had been shattered, but its resonance would haunt her forever. The cold morning light filtered through the overcast sky as Mara Ellison and Simon Hale stood silently amidst the ruins of the waxen gallery. The once imposing structure, a monument to artifice and terror, now lay shattered, a carcass of twisted metal, broken glass, and fragmented wax. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and melted wax, mingling with the earthiness of disturbed soil. Around them, the town was emerging from a heavy fog of fear, the townsfolk cautiously stepping closer, their faces a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and unease. Mara's heart pounded in her chest, but not with the frantic urgency of their desperate battles inside the museum. This was a hollow kind of pounding, a residual echo of the suffocating stillness that had gripped her so tightly in the labyrinthine halls. She bent down, her gloved fingers trailing over a cracked wax figure lying in ruin. The figure's face, once disturbingly lifelike, was now marred by jagged fractures, its uncanny eyes dull and lifeless. The grotesque contrast between what had been and what remained struck Mara with a wave of melancholy. The cold wind whispered through the debris, carrying with it the faintest hint of the museum's lingering curse. Simon watched her closely, his brow furrowed in quiet concern. "Mara," he said softly, "we made it out. The souls are free. The curse is broken." But Mara's eyes did not leave the broken figure. "Does it ever really end, Simon?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The silence, the stillness. It's like it's etched into my bones." Simon stepped closer and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm, grounding. "You're not alone," he reassured her. "We'll face it together." Around them, the townsfolk began to gather their belongings, cautiously reclaiming their lives from the shadow of the waxen gallery. Whispers of gratitude and tentative hope floated through the chilly morning air. But Mara felt the weight of something heavier pressing upon her, a darkness not so easily dispelled by the collapse of a building or the release of trapped souls. The memories surged unbidden, the eerie stillness that had pressed against her skin like a suffocating shroud, the subtle shifts of the wax figure's features that had blurred the line between life and death, the twisted visage of Elias Voss, the curator, whose obsession had imprisoned so many. As the day wore on, Mara found herself retreating from the crowd, seeking solitude by the edge of the ruins. The shards of wax and plaster crunched softly beneath her boots as she walked, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. The sky darkened as clouds gathered, mirroring the storm gathering within her mind. She sat upon a fallen beam, staring into the shadows cast by the ruins. The shapes twisted and flickered in the fading light, reminiscent of the figures trapped beneath layers of wax and time. Her breath caught in her throat as the silence wrapped around her once more, colder and heavier than ever. The suffocating stillness of the waxen gallery had not vanished with its destruction. It had seeped into her very soul, a constant companion in the waking hours and the dreams that plagued her nights. She could still hear the faint whispers, the murmurs of lost voices trapped between worlds, begging for release yet bound eternally beneath the surface. Simon's footsteps approached softly. He sat beside her, his presence a small beacon in the encroaching darkness. "You're stronger than you realize," he said gently. "Whatever this is, we'll face it, and maybe, in time, the silence will lose its grip." Mara nodded slowly, though the knots of dread in her chest remained tight. "I hope so," she murmured, "but I fear the darkness beneath the wax is not so easily escaped." Night descended fully, cloaking the town in shadows. The ruins of the waxen gallery lay silent, but Mara knew that beneath the broken walls and shattered figures, something still lingered, an echo of the horror she had survived. The stillness that had suffocated so many, now a lingering resonance within her own soul. As she rose to leave, Mara cast one last glance at the ruins, her sharp eyes reflecting the distant street lamp's flicker. The darkness beneath the wax was a part of her now, a chilling presence that would haunt her footsteps forever. Yet, beneath that shroud of dread, a flicker of determination sparked. She would carry the weight of this horror, but she would not let it consume her entirely, for in the heart of silence, even the faintest whisper of hope could be heard. And so Mara Ellison stepped forward into the uncertain dawn, her mind echoing with the quiet terror and fragile resilience born from the stillness beneath the wax. The motel room was cloaked in shadows, the single bedside lamp casting a weak, yellow glow that trembled against the walls like a fragile heartbeat. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the worn edges of a photograph she had kept folded in her journal for years. The image was faded, the colors muted by time, but the face was unmistakable, her brother, Samuel. Smiling with a warmth Mara could barely remember anymore. Outside, the rain tapped relentless rhythms against the window pane, a steady percussion that filled the silence with a somber cadence. The room felt claustrophobic, the air thick and heavy, pressing against her chest like the very stillness she had come to fear within the waxen gallery. The suffocating quiet was not unlike that eerie hush that had engulfed the museum's cold holes, the kind of silence that swallowed sound and life alike. Mara's eyes flicked back and forth between the photograph and the notes sprawled across the desk. Her investigation had brought her here, to this moment of raw vulnerability. The disappearances in the town echoed the darkest chapter of her own past, and the parallels clawed at her sanity with relentless ferocity. Each missing visitor was a ghost, a shadow of Samuel's own vanishing years, a unresolved wound festering beneath the surface of her determination. Her hands trembled as she flipped through more images, newspaper clippings, scribbled timelines, cryptic entries from old journals, the faces blurred together, wax figures morphing into memories, the uncanny resemblance between the statues and the missing townsfolk gnawing at her resolve. She swallowed hard, the weight of grief tightening its grip around her throat. A soft knock at the door pulled Mara from her reverie. Simon stepped inside, his eyes heavy with concern, yet steady with unwavering loyalty. He carried a folder thick with research, the fruits of his tireless efforts to untangle the museum's dark history. "I found something," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "But it's not just about the museum anymore. It's about the pattern about your brother, Mara." She looked up, the flicker of hope and pain mingling in her gaze. "Tell me," she whispered, her voice raw but resolute. They sat together, the storm outside a relentless reminder of the turmoil within. Simon laid out the timelines, the occult symbols, the recurring motifs of stillness and entrapment, the disappearances. "Your brother's story, they're connected," he said. "The museum has been feeding on this town's secrets for longer than we realized." Mara nodded, the pieces clicking together in a dark mosaic. But with each revelation, the line between past and present blurred further, the ghosts of memory entwining with the living nightmare she faced. "I can't let this go," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Not until I find out what happened to Sam and to everyone else." The hours slipped away as they pored over every detail, the room shrinking under the weight of their shared obsession. Mara's mind spiraled into restless pacing, the walls closing in like the wax figure's silent gaze. She imagined Samuel's last moments, the fear, the confusion, the cold embrace of stillness. Her breath quickened, heartbeat pounding in tandem with the relentless rain. Late into the night, Mara returned to the images of the museum. One wax figure in particular haunted her, one that had begun to take on the features of her lost brother. Its glassy eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, reflecting not just her anguish but the malevolent life that pulsed beneath the wax. She reached out, fingertips trembling, as if she could touch the soul trapped within. The suffocating silence enveloped her, and for a moment, she felt the terrifying possibility that the boundaries between the living and the preserved were dissolving. The museum was no longer just a place of horror, was a mirror of her own fractured grief, a crucible where past loss and present terror fused into an unbreakable chain. Mara's obsession deepened, her heart tethered to the unanswered questions and the shadows that refused to fade. The echoes of loss reverberated through her bones, driving her forward into the unknown depths of the waxen gallery's secrets, where every step threatened to consume her entirely. The night pressed on, the storm outside relentless, as Mara whispered into the darkness, "I won't let you be forgotten. Sam, I'll find the truth, no matter the cost." And beneath the silence, the wax watched still, eternal, waiting. Simon Hale sat at his cluttered desk, the dim light of a single desk lamp casting deep shadows over piles of research material. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and fading ink, a faint hum of silence filling the cramped room. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced a passage in a brittle, leather-bound tome that described ancient rites and lingering spiritual bindings. A chill ran down his spine as he read words that suggested curses, once thought broken, might endure in subtle, unseen ways. "Mara," he whispered into the phone, voice barely above a breath, "I think the curse isn't over. There are traces remnants of that dark ritual still active, though weakened." Across town, Mara Ellison sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, the walls closing in with the weight of silence. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion etched deep into her face. Nights had become a battleground where sleep eluded her, replaced by visions of waxen faces flickering at the edges of her mind. The shadows cast by the streetlight outside seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own, whispering doubts and fears she struggled to suppress. "Simon," she replied, voice cracking, "I can feel it too. The stillness, the silence beneath it, all it's like something is watching, waiting. I'm not sure I can keep this together much longer." Their conversation was cut short by a sudden, inexplicable cold breeze that swept through the cracked window of Mara's apartment, rattling the thin curtains and stirring the air with an unseen presence. It reminded her unbearably of the waxen galleries, suffocating corridors, and the unsettling quiet that had almost claimed her. Determined to gather more evidence, Simon dove deeper into obscure archives and forgotten journals, piecing together a timeline of the curse's origins and its terrifying resilience. Yet each clue uncovered only served to darken the horizon, revealing that the darkness beneath the wax was not fully extinguished. Meanwhile, Mara's health waned under the relentless pressure of fear and sleeplessness. She found herself shrinking away from the world, her once steady hands trembling, her breath shallow. The paranoia clawed at her mind, a gnawing suspicion that shadows moved just beyond sight, that the waxen figures might still linger in some twisted form, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim what was once theirs. One evening, Mara returned to the ruins of the waxen gallery, drawn by a compulsion she barely understood. The air was heavy, thick with a suffocating silence that pressed against her skin. As she stepped deeper into the skeletal remains of the museum, she felt a whisper brush her ear, a voice soft and cold, calling her name. She spun around, heart pounding wildly, but there was nothing, only the echo of her own breath and the creak of settling rubble. Retreating to Simon's side, Mara collapsed onto his worn couch, fatigue and fear overwhelming her. Simon placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his expression grim but resolute. "We'll find a way through this," he promised quietly. "We have to." Despite their resolve, the unseen shadows that haunted the edges of their lives cast a long, ominous pall. The lingering curse whispered of unfinished business, a darkness that refused to be silenced. Mara and Simon faced the terrifying truth. Some horrors are not easily banished, and the fight to truly end the nightmare was far from over. As Mara drifted into a fitful sleep that night, the silence around her was not peaceful but pregnant with menace. The waxen shadows stirred just out of sight, waiting for their moment to rise again. And beneath the fragile calm, the darkness watched unseen, unyielding and ever hungry. The question that haunted Mara's every waking moment remained. If the curse could not be fully broken, then what price would they pay when it finally claimed its due? The suffocating dread of that unknown future pressed relentlessly, a shadow that would not be shaken, no matter how brightly the day might dawn. And so the unseen shadows lengthened, stretching their cold fingers toward Mara and Simon, promising that the story beneath the wax was far from finished. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting a pallid glow over the cramped police office where Mara sat opposite Detective Warren Fields. The scent of stale coffee and old paper hung heavy in the air, mingling with an undercurrent of unspoken tension. Fields' eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the worn wooden desk as he regarded Mara with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Mara," he began cautiously, "I appreciate your dedication, but you have to understand that basing an investigation on ghosts and curses isn't exactly how the law works. We need tangible evidence, something concrete." Mara's jaw tightened. "I'm not saying the disappearances are caused by ghosts, Warren. But there's something about that museum, something beyond logic. The wax figures, they're not just statues, they change. They mimic the missing." Fields leaned back, his gaze steady. "Or maybe you're seeing what you want to see. People vanish, and the museum is an easy scapegoat. Fear makes us see monsters in shadows." The words stung, but Mara matched his gaze. "Fear also makes us ignore truths. I lost my brother, Warren. I'm not about to let another family suffer because we dismiss what's right in front of us." The detective's expression softened momentarily, but the doubt lingered. "I want to help, Mara, but we need facts, not theories spun from grief." Later that evening, Mara sat in her dimly lit apartment, the worn photograph of her brother clutched tightly in her hands. The rain tapped steadily against the window pane, a rhythmic reminder of the world's relentless march forward, indifferent to her pain. Simon Hale hovered nearby, his voice gentle but firm. "You can't keep going like this, Mara. The tension with Fields, it's wearing you down. Maybe you need to find a middle ground." She shook her head, eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I can't, Simon. This is more than a story. It's personal. If I don't find the truth, who will?" Outside, the streets glistened wet beneath flickering street lamps as Mara and Fields met once more, their breath forming clouds in the chill night air. Words were exchanged, terse and sharp, each unwilling to yield ground. The darkness pressed in around them, an ominous echo of the secrets lurking within the waxen gallery's walls. Back inside, the glow of a single desk lamp illuminated Simon's scattered notes and Mara's restless figure. Her mind raced, torn between the hard facts Fields demanded and the intangible dread that gnawed at her sanity. The boundary between belief and doubt stretched thinner with each passing moment, threatening to snap. As the chapter closed, Mara's determination burned brighter than ever, but the fractures in her alliances deepened. The investigation teetered on the edge not just of uncovering a terrifying truth, but of losing the fragile trust that held their fragile alliance together. Would the chasm between Mara and Fields widen irrevocably, or could the desperate need for answers bridge the gulf between skepticism and belief? The night whispered no promises, only the suffocating stillness of unanswered questions. The air was thick with a suffocating stillness as Mara followed Lydia down the narrow, shadowed passageway concealed beneath the waxen gallery. Every step echoed softly against the cold stone walls, the faint scent of wax and dust lingering in the stale, recycled air. Lydia's hands trembled visibly, clutching a flickering candle that cast long, jittering shadows over the grotesque wax figures lining the hidden alcoves. Mara's pulse quickened. The very atmosphere seemed to press against her lungs, the oppressive silence folding around them like a shroud. At last, they reached a cramped chamber where a single wooden chair stood amid, scattered relics of the museum's dark past, fragments of broken sculptures, faded photographs, and cryptic sketches pinned haphazardly to the damp walls. Lydia sank into the chair, her thin frame sagging with exhaustion and the weight of years spent in fear. Her eyes, wide and wary, flicked nervously to Mara and Simon, who had quietly taken their places nearby, their faces etched with concern. "I never wanted this," Lydia began, her voice barely above a whisper, cracking with raw emotion. "When I first took the job at the Waxen Gallery, I thought it would be just another museum, just another way to make a living. But the curator, Elias Voss, he's not like anyone I've ever known. There's something unnatural about him, something that seeps into the walls and the very air we breathe here." She paused, swallowing hard as her gaze dropped to her trembling hands. "I watched people disappear, colleagues, visitors, friends, and then their faces started appearing on the wax figures, frozen in time, trapped in eternal silence. I tried to leave, but the museum's grip, it's like quicksand. The deeper I tried to pull away, the tighter it held me." Mara's heart clenched at the confession. She had sensed Lydia's fear, the invisible chains that bound her to the place, but hearing it laid bare was a different kind of terror. "But I didn't give up," Lydia continued, her tone shifting, a flicker of defiance igniting in her voice. "I found ways to fight back. Small act sabotage here, secret passages there, disrupting the curator's rituals whenever I could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep some souls from being fully claimed." Simon leaned forward, his glasses catching the candlelight. How did you manage to resist him this long?" Lydia's eyes darkened with haunted memories. "By hiding, by silence, by doing everything in shadows. But it's worn me down. Every day I feel him closing in, the ritual's power growing stronger." The chamber fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant echo of footsteps, slow, deliberate, unmistakably Elias Voss's approach. The sound reverberated through the labyrinthine halls like a death knell, sending a cold shiver through Mara's spine. "We don't have much time," Lydia whispered urgently. "He's coming, and when he arrives, we need to be ready." Mara's hand instinctively reached for her camera, the familiar weight grounding her as she lifted it to capture a faint symbol etched into the waxy surface of a nearby statue, a sigil she had seen before in Simon's research. The scent of cold wax and dust filled her nostrils, mingling with the metallic temps of fear that coated the air. "This symbol," Mara said softly, "it might be the key to breaking the curse." Lydia nodded, eyes flickering with a fragile hope. "It's all I have left." Outside the hidden chamber, the museum's suffocating silence deepened, pressing inward like a living thing. Mara could feel the weight of the curator's gaze, unseen but palpable, tightening the noose around their fragile alliance. Yet, within that darkness, Lydia's courage shone like a fragile ember, a beacon of resistance against the encroaching shadow. As the footsteps grew louder, Mara steeled herself. The battle for the souls trapped beneath the wax was far from over, and the cost of defiance was only just beginning to reveal itself. The stillness that had once suffocated the Waxen Gallery now carried the promise of upheaval. A tremor beneath the frozen surface that might just shatter the curse or consume them all. Her breath hitched as the chamber's door creaked open. The gaunt figure of Elias Voss stepping into the candlelight, eyes gleaming like polished obsidian. Mara's heart hammered in her chest. The curator's presence was a dark tide, inexorable and cold. But the fragile hope Lydia had kindled was a spark she intended to protect at all costs. "You think you can stop me?" Elias's voice was a low, chilling whisper that seemed to echo from the shadows themselves. Mara squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze with a steady resolve. "We're not afraid anymore." Outside, the waxen gallery held its breath, the line between stillness and motion, life and artifice, trembling on the edge of rupture. Beneath the wax, secrets festered, and the story was far from over. The night came with no warning, folding Mara into a darkness that felt more like a shroud than a simple absence of light. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, as if the very air had thickened, pressing against her lungs like a heavy veil. In the depths of her nightmare, her limbs began to stiffen, the sensation creeping up her arms and legs with a terrifying slowness. Her skin felt cool and unyielding, and she knew without doubt that she was turning to wax. The nightmare was vivid, every detail etched in the suffocating silence that clung to her mind. She struggled for breath, the room around her freezing into an eternal stillness. Shadows lengthening and stretching into grotesque shapes that mocked her helplessness. When Mara finally jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, the oppressive quiet of her apartment seemed to echo the nightmare's lingering terror. She sat on the edge of her bed, heart pounding, trying to shake the sensation of being trapped beneath an invisible weight. The wax museum was no longer just a place. It was a presence, seeping into her thoughts, blurring the edges of reality until she could no longer trust what she saw. Days passed in a haze of restless pacing and obsessive examination. Mara spread her photographs across her small kitchen table, each image a frozen moment of eerie perfection. The wax figure's eyes, glossy and unblinking, seemed to flicker with a life of their own. Whenever she looked away and then glanced back, their gazes appeared to shift, following her movements with an unnerving sentience. The uncanny valley was no longer a concept, but a prison she inhabited. Every sound was muffled, every breath felt labored, as if the stillness had infiltrated the very air around her. Simon arrived one afternoon, concern etched across his face as he stepped cautiously into the cramped apartment filled with scattered notes and photographs. He found Mara pacing, her movements jittery and erratic, her eyes wide and haunted. "Mara, you need to rest," he urged gently, but she shook her head, voice trembling. "It's not just the museum anymore. It's everywhere. The silence, the stillness, it's suffocating. Sometimes I feel like I'm already trapped, like I'm turning to wax." She paused, her breath catching. "I don't know how much longer I can fight this." Simon reached out, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "We'll find a way. Lydia's information, the research, it's not over yet. You're not alone in this." But even as he spoke, the doubt in his voice betrayed the growing weight of their predicament. The curse, it seemed, was more than a physical trap. It was a psychological prison, tightening its grip with every passing hour. Late that night, Mara's phone vibrated softly on the bedside table. Lydia's voice was a whisper, trembling with urgency and fear. "Mara, listen to me," she said. "The wax isn't confined to the museum anymore. It's spreading, reaching beyond those walls. You have to be careful. If it gets inside your mind, it won't just freeze you, it claim you." The line went dead, leaving Mara alone with the echo of those chilling words. The boundaries between wax and flesh, between life and stillness, were dissolving. The horror beneath the wax was not contained. It was coming for her. Mara's world had contracted into a suffocating cage, where shadows moved just beyond sight and silence screamed in her ears. The uncanny valley deepened around her, each breath a struggle, each moment a battle against the encroaching coldness. She was trapped, not just by the wax, but by the terror it wrought, an unyielding dread that threatened to consume her very soul. And as the darkness pressed closer, she knew the fight was far from over. Somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the wax and the stillness, the true horror waited, patient and eternal. The line between reality and nightmare blurred with every tick of the clock. Mara's mind churned with fragmented memories, half-formed fears, and the inescapable sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. The wax figures haunted her waking hours, their silent gazes penetrating deeper than any spoken word. She reached for her camera one last time, trembling fingers framing the lens to capture what she feared most, the undeniable truth that she was slipping away, becoming part of the stillness she so desperately sought to escape. But in the darkest moments, a flicker of defiance sparked within her. She would not succumb without a fight. The uncanny valley may have deepened, and the suffocation may have tightened its grasp. But Mara Ellison was still breathing, still searching, still resisting the eternal silence beneath the wax. And somewhere in the depths of that suffocating nightmare, hope clung stubbornly to life. The brittle air inside the shattered waxen gallery clung to Mara like a suffocating shroud. Each breath a laborious effort beneath the weight of silence and shadow. The ruin that once held the town's most macabre attraction now lay fractured and hollow. Yet the oppressive stillness remained, a palpable reminder that the darkness was not yet undone. Mara's eyes traced the cracked surfaces of the wax figures, their forms frozen in grotesque postures, faces twisted with the faintest echoes of pain and longing. The unnatural lifelessness, once so maddeningly deceptive, now felt like a living entity, watching, waiting. Her fingers clenched the straps of her bag, heart hammering against ribs that felt too fragile for the terror they bore. Footsteps echoed suddenly, startling in the emptiness. Simon peered through a broken archway, his breath ragged, his eyes gleaming with urgency and exhaustion. Clutched in his hands was an ancient tome, bound in cracked leather and inscribed with symbols Mara barely dared to decipher. "I found something," he panted, stepping closer, "something that might finally give us a way to end this for good." Mara nodded, swallowing the lump of dread lodged in her throat. "Show me." They gathered beneath the skeletal remains of a shattered chandelier, the flickering candlelight casting long, trembling shadows that danced against the crumbling walls. Lydia, pale and trembling, joined them, her hands shaking as she held a folded piece of parchment, worn with age and secrets. "There's a legend," Lydia whispered, voice barely above the cold wind that seeped through the broken windows. "About Elias Voss's soul, how it's tethered to the wax, bound in a circle of eternal stillness. They say if you break the circle, the curse can be undone. But the price," her voice faltered, eyes wide with terror, "the price is steep." Mara's gaze hardened, the weight of the past, of the vanished visitors, and of her lost brother pressed down, but beneath it all burned a fierce resolve. She would not let the darkness consume her, not yet, not without a fight. "We face it," she said quietly, "because if we don't, no one else will." Simon opened the tome, revealing cryptic passages and diagrams of arcane symbols, circles of binding, waxen seals, and incantations that twisted the fabric of reality itself. The words seemed to hum with a dark energy, the air thickening as if the gallery itself responded to their presence. Together they prepared, each movement deliberate and trembling, as the suffocating dread wrapped tighter, gnawing at their sanity. Mara's mind raced with memories of the eerie stillness, the shifting faces, and that final, terrible moment when she nearly became part of the macabre collection. Outside, the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, fragile and pale against the oppressive night. Inside, Mara steadied her breath, feeling the cruel irony that this fight was far from over, that beneath the wax there was still a darkness clawing to remain. As the candle's flame flickered low, she whispered a vow into the silence. She would face the darkness, no matter what it demanded, because some horrors, no matter how suffocating, must be confronted to reclaim even the faintest hope of freedom. And in the gathering gloom, Mara braced herself for whatever nightmare awaited beyond the veil of stillness. The shadows lengthened. The wax seemed to breathe. The darkness was watching. And Mara was ready. The thin line between what was real and what was conjured by exhaustion and grief blurred steadily for Mara as she sat alone in the muted light of her apartment. Around her, the walls were crowded with images, photographs of the wax figures, close-ups of their glassy eyes, notes scrawled hastily on paper, and the edges of a faded photograph of her brother, whose absence echoed louder each day. The silence was suffocating, pressing like the wax itself, all-encompassing and smothering. She traced the worn edges of the picture with a trembling finger, her breath catching as the weight of loss settled around her like a shroud. Her nights were worse. They folded into one another, a kaleidoscope of fractured dreams and waking nightmares. In one recurring vision, she found herself wandering the endless hallways of the waxing gallery. But the corridors were no longer static. They shifted and breathed, the walls pulsing with a faint, unnatural rhythm. Faces emerged from the wax, their eyes glassy and unblinking, whispering words just beyond comprehension. The air was thick with stillness, yet alive with an oppressive presence. Mara's heart pounded, her limbs heavy with dread, as if the very fabric of time was stretching and crushing her simultaneously. The fear of being frozen forever, trapped in a silent tableau, seized her with every step. The boundary between what was living flesh and what was hardened wax grew impossibly thin. Simon's voice was the tether that kept her from completely unraveling. They met one afternoon in a crowded cafe, the noise and warmth a stark contrast to the cold silence Mara had been drowning in. His glasses caught the light as he leaned forward, concern etched into his features. "Mara, you need to take a step back. This obsession, it's destroying you. We can find another way together." But Mara's eyes burned with a haunted intensity. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice brittle. "If I don't get this, if I don't find the truth, they'll be lost forever, just like my brother." Simon's hands clenched into fists on the table, torn between anger and empathy. "I'm scared for you. This isn't just about the museum anymore. It's eating you alive." The tension between them hung heavy, a fragile thread stretched taut by fear and love. Late at night, Mara found herself drawn back to the ruins of the waxen gallery. The collapse had left jagged shadows and splintered stone, but in the crumbled remains, the echo of the curator's presence lingered. She reached out, touching a cracked wax hand half buried in the rubble. The cold hardness beneath her fingertips sent a shiver through her, but it was more than cold stone or wax. It was a touch of the past, of souls trapped in eternal stillness. Memories flooded her mind, the vanished visitors, the curator's tragic obsession with capturing life forever, and the suffocating silence that had swallowed the museum whole. She felt the weight of loss settle deep in her chest, mingling with a fragile resolve. The horror beneath the wax was not just a thing of the museum. It had become a part of her. Mara's journey had brought her to the edge of a precipice, where reality and nightmare intertwined. The obsession that had once been her weapon against forgetting was now a prison of its own making. Yet even in that tenuous place, a spark of clarity remained, a hope that by embracing the darkness, she might find a way to finally break free. As the night deepened, She closed her eyes and let the silence envelop her, listening to the faint echo of whispers beneath the wax, knowing that some boundaries, once crossed, could never be fully repaired. The story was far from over. The thin boundary that separated artifice from reality, life from frozen death, was a fragile veil, and Mara was about to discover just how easily it could tear apart. The silence was a living thing. Mara felt it coil around her ribs like smoke, thick and suffocating, every breath a battle against the invisible pressure pressing her inward. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a crypt. The flickering candlelight cast monstrous shadows on the peeling wallpaper, each movement of flame twisting the darkness into shapes that seemed to leer and reach. She sat curled on the threadbare rug, knees drawn close, hands trembling as she stared at the wavering light. The night stretched endlessly, the stillness oppressive, unyielding. Her mind wandered back to the waxen gallery, to the cold, unblinking eyes of the figures that had haunted her dreams. Those statues, they weren't mere wax and pigments, she realized with a shudder. They were prisons, vessels of frozen souls, trapped in eternal silence. The memory of the curator's gaunt face, his obsidian eyes like voids swallowing light, lingered like a spectre in the corners of her thoughts. A soft knock at the door startled her, sharp in the quiet. Simon stepped inside, his breath a gust of cold air scented faintly of rain. He carried a bundle of old, dust-coated books and a battered notebook filled with scribbled notes and faded photographs. "Thought you might need these," he said quietly, his voice a low anchor in the storm of her mind. Mara managed a weak smile, the first in days. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fragile but grateful. They sat together at the small kitchen table, the lamplight casting warm pools of glow on the yellowed pages. Simon's steady presence was a balm, grounding her as they pored over the history of the town, the occult practices, and the cursed legacy that had shadowed the waxen gallery. But even amidst the comfort, Mara felt the silence creeping back. It was in the spaces between words, the pauses laden with unspoken fears. She spoke of her dreams, the endless corridors where the wax figures followed, their faces morphing into those of the missing, their glassy eyes voids of sorrow and warning. Simon listened, his brow furrowed, the weight of her words settling heavily between them. That night, Mara's dreams twisted into a nightmare. She wandered the labyrinth of the waxen gallery once more. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the chest of some great slumbering beast. Shadows curled like smoke tendrils around her feet, and the wax figures stirred, their statuesque stillness breaking into subtle, terrifying movements. Their eyes gleamed with a terrible awareness, cold and unblinking. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. The silence was absolute, a suffocating void that swallowed her whole. Awakening with a start, Mara gasped, heart pounding against her ribs as if trying to break free. The dawn light seeped weakly through the curtains, pale and uncertain. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands clenched into fists, the echo of the dream still thick in her veins. It was a reminder, no matter how far she fled, the darkness beneath the wax followed. It was not just a place, but a presence, a resonance of silence that had taken root inside her. Days passed, each marked by the same struggle, the oppressive stillness that threatened to consume her from within, the memories twisting like barbs at the edges of her sanity. Simon's visits became lifelines, brief respites from the encroaching shadows. They talked openly now about the curse, the ritual, the souls freed but not wholly released. The knowledge that the darkness might linger was a heavy burden, but it also gave Mara a fragile thread of hope. One evening, As the city's hum softened into night, Mara stood by her apartment window. Outside, the town moved on, oblivious to the horrors she had faced. The morning light would soon break, promising a new day, yet inside her, the shadow remained a silent, unyielding echo of all that had transpired beneath the wax. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, willing herself to hold onto the tentative thread of resolve. The horror was not over, but neither was she broken. The silence beneath the wax was a part of her now, but it would not define the rest of her story. She would carry its memory, a chilling resonance of loss and suffocation, but she would also carry the strength to face whatever came next. Outside, the first birds began their morning song, fragile notes piercing the lingering darkness. Mara opened her eyes, a faint, determined light kindling within them. The waxen gallery was gone, but the shadows it cast would follow her forever. Still, she would not be swallowed by the silence, not yet. The stillness was a presence, a shadow, a memory etched deep beneath the surface. Yet beneath that, Mara found the faintest pulse of life, fragile, trembling, but unmistakably real. And in that pulse, she found the beginning of her fight to reclaim herself from the resonance of silence. The first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the horizon, spilling a muted light over the blackened bones of the waxen gallery. Mara Ellison stood silent amidst the ruin, the charred remnants of what had once been an eerie sanctuary of frozen figures now reduced to ash and twisted metal. A bitter wind whispered through the skeletal remains, carrying with it a haunting echo of voices long silenced, a ghostly murmur that clung to the ruins like a shroud. She inhaled deeply, the air sharp and cold, tasting faintly of smoke and decay. The silence that enveloped the scene was profound yet unbearable, a suffocating void that seemed to press against her chest as tangibly as the oppressive atmosphere she had escaped days before. Mara's eyes traced the shattered wax figures scattered like fallen giants. Their once lifelike forms, now grotesque and distorted. Yet beneath the ruin, beneath the shattered shells, she could feel the lingering presence. The darkness that had dwelled beneath the wax was not so easily vanquished. Simon Hale approached quietly, his familiar steady presence a thin thread of grounding in the swirling tempest of Mara's thoughts. "It's over," he said softly, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "Over." Mara echoed, her gaze fixed on a fragment of wax that eerily resembled a face she had seen countless times before. "I don't think it ever really ends. Not for me, not for any of us." The journey back to her small apartment was a blur, the outside world seeming unreal, as if she was still trapped between the layers of nightmare and reality. Once inside, she sank into the chair behind her desk, where dozens of photographs of the wax figures and frantic notes lay scattered in disarray. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the keyboard, the half-finished article mocking her from the screen. The words refused to come. The memory of suffocating stillness, the uncanny movements of wax and shadow, the curator's cold obsidian easel converged into a storm that clouded her mind. Night descended quickly, and Mara found herself pacing the cramped apartment, the pale glow of the street lamp outside casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. The silence was absolute but fraught with menace. Every creak of the building, every distant sound felt amplified, a whisper of the museum's lingering curse. Her breath hitched as the faintest murmur brushed against her ears, an indistinct voice that stirred a cold dread deep within her. She paused, pressed her hands against her temples, fighting the rising tide of paranoia. The darkness that had once lived beneath the wax was no longer tethered to the museum's walls. It had seeped into her, a shadowy stain upon her soul, Mara knew she could never fully escape it. The suffocating stillness had become part of her existence, a permanent echo beneath the surface of her thoughts. Sinking back into her chair, Mara closed her eyes. The weight on her chest was real, a crushing presence that pressed down with relentless force. It was as though the trapped souls she had freed had left behind a residue of their torment, an invisible tether binding her to the horror she had witnessed. Yet within that crushing despair, a flicker of defiance remained. She would endure. She had to. Her fingers found the keyboard at last, typing slowly, each word a small act of rebellion against the silence that sought to consume her. The story of the waxen gallery that vanished, the curator, the cursed wax would live on, not as a whisper in the dark, but as a testament to the horrors beneath the surface, to the price of frozen stillness and the terror of being trapped in time. But as dawn gave way to day, Mara knew one truth above all: the darkness beneath the wax was eternal. It had marked her, reshaped her, and would haunt her forever. The waxen gallery was gone, but its shadow lingered, a suffocating presence that would never release its hold. And somewhere, deep inside, Mara wondered, was she still truly free? Or merely another figure trapped beneath the wax, frozen in a nightmare that refused to end? The room grew colder, the silence thickening like a living thing. Mara's breath quickened. Somewhere beyond the edge of perception, the faintest whisper stirred once more, a soft but chilling reminder that beneath the wax, beneath the stillness, the darkness waited. Always, her story was finished, but the terror was not. The suffocating silence beneath the wax had become her companion, a shadow she could neither escape nor deny. And as the first light of day filtered through the window, Mara Ellison, survivor and witness, embraced the unrelenting dread that would haunt her every waking moment. Because beneath the wax, the darkness never truly dies.